All right. I think we'll get a rolling start. So I want to welcome you all back to our first panel session of the symposium, and it's titled Critical Perspectives on AI, Big Data, and Autonomous Weapons. We have a very interdisciplinary group of people, and rather than introducing them all myself, I would ask them to introduce themselves as they get started. The order I will be using is to have Sarah begin her presentation, followed by Mike Ananny, and then we will ask Ingmar Weber to speak about his work, followed by Christian Heck, and following that, we will have Neil Renic, and finally, Jessica and Lauren just commenting on what you've heard and share more insights. So let's start with Sarah. Go for it.
Thank you. Very happy to be here and very happy to follow the amazing talks we just heard. I'm Sarah Ciston. I work on bringing intersectional perspectives to machine learning, and in particular look at large language models and how to bring in theories from queer theory, feminist theory, and anti-racist theories and practices into thinking about how do we fundamentally rethink these systems. And so lately I've been trying to trace some of the AI decision-making systems used for warfare and look at how they hop domains from warfare into commercial uses as we see in our phones. So I've been looking at almost 50 case studies to date. I'm looking not at the kind of automated weapon systems or the automated vehicles, but particularly the AI tools that are aiding in gathering and processing data and making models. So exactly the tools that we were speaking about in our last talks. And these are the very same private companies making them as you might expect. I'm just gonna toggle through, if I can get the clicker to work. It doesn't seem to be going. It is, okay. Sorry, there's 50, that's probably really hard to see from here, just to give you a sense of the kind of overwhelming amount of data here. This list goes back to 2000. But so it's who you might expect. It's not only weapons manufacturers and defense contractors, but also the same big companies. It's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, and Facebook. And then also these sort of hybrids that have come up like Palantir, who are technically defense companies, but they have this, this specialization in tech. And it's really showing how AI has been shifting this balance of power from state actors to this mix of corporate interests and sort of these strange privatized entanglements. And I would very much, we have a room full of experts, so I would invite contributions to this work, which is very much a work in progress. And so I want to be looking at these technical aspects, not to set aside the horrific impacts, but to help us make these more tangible and to find ways to make people more accountable to this work. And so what I'm finding is that the machine learning processes themselves are exactly the same. Every kind of machine learning task is applicable to warfare. It's combining fallible parts and fallible people in all of these. They're always socio-technical systems. It's really undermining the idea of a human in the loop because there's no way to confirm a truly human decision when that decision is entirely algorithmically co-constructed. And all of these are building on non-machine learning infrastructure. Just as Jessica and Lauren were saying, if it's all built on networks of cameras, we need to be intervening in these systems actually before they've been created to intervene in the non-machine learning networks that they're built upon, because this technology is already in our pockets. So I'm trying to look at how do we make these connections to understand these tasks, because they actually are, I feel like it raises the stakes for the tools that are already in our pockets. If I'm thinking about like charting these across from the military tasks that they're used for, from capturing and collecting, sorting and ranking like Lavender does, and then trying to bring it across through the actual task, machine learning task that involves, to what is the machine learning task used for in a commercial or a civil tool. And so in the case of something like Lavender, it would be your Amazon shopping or your movie recommendation system. And it's pretty terrifying to me that these are the exact same systems. And so I'm interested in how we might consider together what's our tangible role in impacting these global warfare systems. On top of the tech makers, as tech researchers and tech users, how might we start to bring these conversations into the same room? When I'm having a conversation about AI and art, or media, or AI and warfare, or media and AI, why are we not having these conversations in the same room? And where might we intervene as we choose our tools? And how can we imagine different systems where we're not beholden to the infrastructures of these companies whose decisions we don't agree with?
Thanks, Sarah. It's such a treat to follow Sarah and to be here. Nitin, thank you very much for the invitation. I wanted to start off by saying I'm not a scholar of conflict settings. I'm not even a scholar of autonomous weapons. But what I study, so I'm at the University of Southern California at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and I study journalism, and I study journalists, and how they do what they do, and why they do what they do, and how new technologies like generative AI are sort of influence what they do and influence the kinds of decisions that they make. So I come at this from sort of with an interest in thinking about where do our news stories come from, what kinds of language do journalists use in creating those stories, and how do those decisions about language have resonance and impact on how conflicts are reported and how conflicts have meaning in the world. So I come at that with sort of this focus on language and this focus on journalism, and some of the work that I've been doing lately has been studying with Jake Carr, who's at the NYU Law School, has been studying how journalists are using generative AI in their work. And when you talk to them, there's often sort of a reticence to say that they are, but when you sort of dig in deep and talk to them about how they do their work, they openly say that they're using it for sourcing, for trying to figure out who to interview about stories, to generate interview questions, to analyze patterns of data, evidence that they don't necessarily understand and want explained to them, to transcribe interviews, to draft first frames of stories, outlines of stories, editing stories, figuring out how to circulate those stories. What's often called sort of back-end work of journalism is pretty heavily influenced by a lot of synthetic media systems, and that sort of under-the-hood work that's happening. So I come at this topic and this question sort of curious about how does that back-end work sort of influence the kind of language that finds its way into news stories? There's a great media scholar, Roger Silverstone, who talks about the, quote, proper distance that media creates from some kind of conflict setting or some kind of event. And I think the language that journalists use is part of creating this, quote, proper distance, this sort of type of mediated witnessing that we heard about in the first panel for sure. So what I wanted to do is just really quickly put on the table some of the places in a journalistic workflow that we are seeing synthetic media playing out and where it's happening. And some of this is a little bit old school, but to offer these as sort of places where we might think critically about how journalists either adopt the language that generative AI is giving them, but also how they tend to sort of smuggle in or feed in interpretation. Journalists have a long history of sort of saying they're, quote, just reporting facts, they're just reporting neutral statements of truth, but we know that journalists in their language do sort of slide in interpretation. So one of the places we see this happening is just sort of the relationship to large language data sets. We know there's a very large language set called Newsroom, which comes from the New York Times, which sort of informs a lot of how news stories are summarized. But this is sort of a type of news language that's statistical, it's computational, it's probabilistic. But we also know journalists tend to use what Elizabeth Lopari, who's a feminist scholar, calls, quote, stance words. So if you really pay attention to news stories closely, you'll see words like obviously, or finally, or only. And these are sort of judgment words that appear inside of news stories, but give a little sense of how journalists are thinking about the events they're covering. We see passive versus active voices sliding into news stories. Who was responsible for an event happening? We've seen this especially happening in Gaza. Euphemisms, irony, sort of temporalities. When did an event start to a journalist? When did it stop? Juxtapositions or orderings within news stories. These are sort of types of language that flow in. We also see sort of what are called evidentiary language, sort of when are anecdotes relied upon, when are quantitative patterns reported on, which kind of bureaucratic sources are quoted in stories or not. And then we also see sort of the role of newsroom guidelines or style guidelines that are supposed to police the kind of language that journalists are using. I say all this not because there's necessarily a recipe, but when we watch journalists using generative AI, sometimes they're aware of these patterns. Sometimes they're aware of a stance word like only or finally. Sometimes they're aware of how to describe a conflict or not. Sometimes they're aware of when to use anecdotal evidence or not. But this kind of self-reflexivity that some journalists have in relation to their work, but honestly many don't, is for me sort of a critical moment for trying to understand how could journalists, especially in a conflict setting where word choice, language, responsibility, accountability, passive voice, active voice, these are such critical types of choices that need to be made in terms of constructing language. At the same time, we're seeing this sort of rush into a perceived acceptance of the neutrality or authority or objectivity of synthetically generated language. So partly it's an observation coming from field work we're doing, but it's also partly a plea that I wanted to put out there, is to think about where does our news language come from and how much of that language lives in journalistic decision making, which would be great and defensible and a kind of accountability that could come from it, but how much of that language comes from automated synthetic generated systems that often offer, quote, good enough starting points for news descriptions of conflict. So a plea for some criticality and self-reflexivity in terms of news language. And I'll stop there.
Great, yeah, thanks. I see, okay. So far it's not, so thanks Nitin and the organizers for inviting me. So far it's not yet. Okay, I have some slides and I like to stand, so it's getting ready. Okay, perfect. Click. Okay, great. So I'm a computer scientist and my main strength is thinking creatively about data. So I want to start with a data source you might not be aware of. So this is a screenshot of Facebook's advertising platform, okay? And so here I'm about to launch an advertising campaign targeting people in Colombia, Norte de Santander, which is sort of on the border with Venezuela. And down here, you see that I'm only targeting Facebook users who lived in Venezuela, right? There's a migration background. And then before I launch the ad and before I have to pay anything, Facebook tells me how many people match my targeting criteria up here, right? So I can remotely, at a distance, sort of do like a census of essentially migration, right? And just to emphasize, so this is publicly accessible, right? You don't need any partnership with Facebook, right? You just Google how to set up a Facebook ad and you'll eventually end up on the screen. Okay, so how does this sort of relate to my work? So in 2018, people from the UN, in particular UNICEF, contacted me to try to better estimate the Venezuelan exodus, right? So how many people had left from Venezuela into Colombia, right? This is what it looks like. This is a bridge between the two countries, right? The so-called Simon Bolivar International Bridge, right? And so then what we did, we collected this data from Facebook, which is sort of here through the advertising platform, right? Estimating how many people who previously lived in Venezuela were at that point living, for example, in Bogota, right? So this gives this distribution from Facebook, and this is data that was collected around the same time by the Colombian government using voluntary self-registration data, right? And so if you sort of compare the two, you'd see Facebook suggests actually quite a larger number sort of away from the border, right? And so the question is who's wrong, who's right? And so actually this is likely to be closer to the truth because people on the ground told us these registration efforts were more pronounced on the border, but once somebody had actually sort of, traveled further inland, there was very little incentive for them to register, right? So point being, right, in this case, sort of, surveillance capitalism has, better data on migration than the government concerned, right? And sort of how can we sort of tap into this? You can go beyond the actual number. You can try to estimate their sort of socioeconomic status by looking at the devices people use. So whenever you see a location indicated here, it's always people from Venezuela residing at that location. So for example, here at the very left, you have people in Roraima, Brazil, right? These are so-called caminantes who sort of, cross into the Amazonian jungle. And there almost nobody has access to an iOS device, right? Only 3% are using iOS devices to access Facebook. On the other side, you have people to make it all the way to the United States. And actually the majority of them are using iOS devices to access Facebook, right? And now you can sort of try to build a model to map this percentage of iOS device to something like income, right? So essentially you train a model to predict per country GDP. This works surprisingly well. And then you can say, okay, if these people in Roraima were a country in Latin America, that country would have a per capita GDP of around $3,000, right? So this does not apply at the individual level, but as a group, fairly vulnerable, right? And so in all of our modeling, we sort of see, right, sort of these three groups emerge, right? Where we're quite comfortable saying, right, the people who essentially stay in the neighborhood are probably most vulnerable. Who people stay in Latin America, but a bit further, sort of, or so, they're doing slightly better. And to people make it all the way to Spain or the US, in general, at the group level, not individual level, they're probably of least concern. Now, we can do something similar in Ukraine, right? Sort of, so where we look at Facebook users within Ukraine. In this case, it's sort of in Kiev. This is joint work with the University of Oxford, I should emphasize. And here, for example, right, we sort of see that. Exactly. No, one sec. Sorry. That the sort of Facebook users among women, right, sort of dropped more, right, sort of. This is now like an estimate of the people remaining in Kiev than among men, right, like sort of. So you can do like sort of like real-time population estimates. In this case, in a sort of conflict setting. One other line of work we're doing is using satellite imagery. So this is satellite images from Syria, Al-Bab, where at some point you sort of see cars, right, and then the cars sort of disappear, right? And by counting cars, doing this across time, you can again sort of get a signal for internal displacement. This imagery is expensive to get, right? So typically you don't easily have access to a satellite as academics. This sort of imagery is lower resolution. It's much easier to obtain. You can no longer see cars in this, right? But if you look very, very carefully, you'd see there's sort of more texture here than here, right? So this is actually like a Saturday in Germany on a sort of busy DIY tool store. This is a Sunday where the store is closed. So this gives you so-called weak annotations to train a computer vision algorithm to detect between these 2 days. And then essentially you can sort of figure out how busy the parking lots are. And so you can sort of reason about more or less real-time displacement through sort of car scene. Now, to quickly wrap up, one more slide, sort of, so, oh yes, quick recap of German history. Census in 1933, right, just sort of after Hitler came to power. This was planned before. The goal of the census was to identify Jews, Roma, and other minorities. So Hitler was lucky that at this point there was this so-called punch cards, right, like a technical revolution, which allowed record linkage, right? In the keynote at the beginning, we already heard about networks, right? So previously to this, essentially people would ask, are you Jewish? Yes, no. If you're not Jewish, okay, fine. End of history, right? Now, through this technical innovation, they could also ask your grandfather, okay, your grandfather is Jewish, you're not Jewish. They could link the records. That was previously not possible, right? And sort of then say, okay, then you're also 1/4 Jewish, right? So thanks to this technical innovation, the number of estimated Jews went up from 500,000 to 2 million. Not due to conversion, just due to sort of better data and better technology, right? So that's, I guess, so right, so better data, right, sort of helped, led to better outcomes, right, or in this case helped to optimize the Holocaust, right? And so closer to my work, right, so one thing that always concerns me is, right, two benefits from this sort of things, right, like sort of, so I mean, we are doing this mostly with sort of open source data, right, hopefully this helps level the field, right, but ultimately a lot of this migration work, right, sort of feeds into this sort of fortress Europe, right, or if you're looking for a job, right, like Frontex is hiring or was hiring like a lead data scientist, right, sort of they're very interested in these things as well, right, so how do we ensure that, right, we sort of empower migrants or sort of, so rather than maybe some other organizations, right, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, hi. On 3rd of April this year, the IDF claimed that Lavender, the AI-based decision support systems, Yuval Abraham just made public 3 hours before that Lavender, it's just a tool like a hammer or a pen, or it's just a database. Not a system to predict terrorist activity or to identify Hamas fighters. It is even not a system at all, they say. Well, on the one hand, I would agree. I would be more precise. I would say it's not just a database, it's a big database. But on the other hand, I would absolutely disagree, because the systems are not just tools. Also, there are much more than just technical objects or technical systems. They are a system in the cybernetic sense, which means the environment and man and machine depends on each other and rely on each other. And that's nothing new to us, thinking in terms of system. Also, to use tech to help us to build our world, to keep it more safe for us, to reduce uncertainties and danger in it. That has always been a basic quality of tech. But what is relatively new phenomenon is that we have started not just to stabilize the world, but to predict and to anticipate the future as precisely as possible with the help of statistic models, with stochastics, computer simulations, and big data algorithms, not rarely to prevent future conflict, crimes, terrorist threats proactively, which is called preemption. The next slide. When Donald Trump says, like you've done before 2 weeks ago, the enemy is in the inner, he says nothing else than Rumsfeld 20 years ago in trying to catch the given scientific methods and technological innovations with them to catch the unknown, or in other words of Louis Amour, the retailer's dream of an unknown consumer met the state's nightmare of the unknown terrorist. So preemption requires a collective acceptance of the future as a threat. And in that techno-political mindset, systems like Lavender are designed and they are used. And through that usage, they became reality and expressed their concrete consequences for culture, societies in crisis, and for civilians in armed conflict. So, systems like Lavender help soldiers and securities to navigate through completely technically generated realities, at best in machine speed, like we've heard before, to give the realities a meaning and embed them into concrete military operational practices, and to make sense out of something soldiers cannot see with their own eyes and cannot think with their own minds. But still, these soldiers have in their operational centers, they have to make concrete decisions which often have death as a consequence. While civil society have not much concrete knowledge about the inner of that military black box called Lavender, we could gain a lot of knowledge thanks to investigative journalists and to whistleblowers on the historicities inscribed in that systems. So let's dive into one of that black box and open it up. Some specific functions which pre-interpret the reality for soldiers, functions they rely on and have to trust. While I always realize when I talk to those soldiers, when I interview them, but also have them as friends, of course, that they have no clue about these inner functions. Here in that slide, you see a system called Embers, which have the same historicity inscribed than Lavender, and it was funded by the IARPA, designed by 10 institutions, 70 academics, which is usual. It was tested and evaluated between 2012 and 16 to identify and to predict protests, unrests, and violent riots in Latin America. And then in 2014 and 2016, they used the same system also in North Africa and in the Middle East. Embers encodes events out of newspapers and open source data from social media and so on, which you can see on the right side. It's kind of an event encoder, we call it. And then they categorize them, which you see on the left side in the architecture, and the data processing block, and ranks them, you see in the model ecosystem. Well, let us short extract two of those functions which are in them. And I use those functions because they are common, and also they are representative for these systems, for many more functions with the same concerning behaviors. The first is a process called sentiment analysis. I think you can, yeah. In Embers, it was not machine learning based, but it was lexicon based on a lexicon called a new lexicon. This lexicon, this base, was created in the University of Florida as a psychology lecture series. The lexicon provides normative and emotional ratings. While the students interviewed for this lexicon came from Florida, around 18, 20 years old, of course they had their demographic, cultural, and linguistic regularities. In this way, those specific cultural Western values, they were formalized and written into prediction system in a very concrete way. And remember, the system, they were used for crisis prevention in the Middle East and in North Africa. The second function I want to show, it's in the model ecosystem, thank you, to rank if an encoded event keeps the potential to escalate or if there are violence, if there will be a violent act following after. They're implemented word-to-vec, a pre-trained deep neural net that transforms words into vector representations and captures semantic relationships. Also here we can see that since NLP community and AI community works with that method, with pre-trained language models, we are not able to fix all the types of social biases which appears while we use them, biases ranging from gender to age, from sexual orientation to ethnicity, from religion to culture. There come to the end, to the interface between soldiers and the inner functions, where the functions touch the world, let's say, and the dignity of man, to interactions through soldiers and chatbot systems, a la ChatGPT, with pre-trained large language models in their inner to support decision-making on the battlefield. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Hello, I'm Neil Renic. I work at the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen, and my research mostly focuses on the changing character and regulation of war, the ethics of killing, and emerging military technologies. So I'm going to quickly flag an aspect of military AI and autonomous weapons that I think is important and sometimes under-considered. That is the role of great power politics and the growing belief among many in the West that these technologies are a civilizational necessity. So in discussions over the future promise of military AI, significant attention is given to speed, as already mentioned today, and the accelerating pace of warfare. Autonomous weapons and military AI, it is argued, have the unique potential to operate at a tempo faster than humans can possibly replicate. And this will allow us to compress the kill chain, identify targets faster, and eliminate targets faster. And underpinning all of this is a belief not just in the advantage, but in the necessity of speed. A belief that future conflicts will require decisions to be made faster, within hours, minutes, or possibly even seconds. And a belief among states that they'll need to match this intensity or fall behind in relation to their adversaries. So fight future wars at machine speed or lose future wars at machine speed. There's also a lot of noise made about autonomous weapons as a potential form of affordable mass, motivated by some of the battlefield developments in Ukraine. The United States and others are looking to develop swarms of cheap autonomous drones. So the US sees cheap mass in the form of autonomous drone swarms as one way to offset Chinese numerical military advantage. Now, obviously, none of these developments are happening in a political vacuum. Great power politics has ratcheted back up, and arms control is dead or dying. The Russo-Ukrainian war continues, and there's growing tensions over the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So amidst all this, there's a growing fixation on the anticipated value of military AI and the perceived importance of not falling behind in the race to militarily modernize. And a lot of this discourse works to generate a sense of inevitability around autonomous weapons. Our enemies are building this technology, so we have no choice but to do the same. And this mentality can and is generating a lot of problems, I'd argue. I've spoken to multiple people from Western countries who have explicitly said that the legal and ethical issues of military AI are secondary to winning a race against China, or insert whatever other civilizational other you want, Russia, Iran. Now, for those of us who think that there are legal and ethical problems to this technology, and those problems are profound, this is intensely worrying. What this mentality also guarantees, I'd argue, is a blindness to the very real possibility that artificial intelligence will fall well short of its military promise, that it will generate these moral and legal problems while also performing badly in critical military functions such as targeting. So what would I like to see? I'd firstly like to see a rejection of the deliberate, politically motivated framing of military AI and autonomous weapons as an inevitability. Even if both prove to be in retrospect, I think this mindset is an unhealthy one. According to many, the pursuit of military artificial intelligence cannot be stopped or even slowed down, lest we cede supremacy over this technology to our adversaries. And this framing of AI and machine learning development as an imperative imposed by competition functions to foreclose meaningful discussions over the character and speed of these technological choices. And they are choices. I think we need to be very careful about this kind of inevitabilizing language, these discourses that say we have no choice, we have no agency, we have to go full steam ahead in regards to this technology. Because whatever the geopolitical incentives going forward, and there clearly are some powerful ones, policymakers retain agency over the development and use of AI. If this technology is integrated into areas of war where it shouldn't be, or at a pace that intensifies rather than mitigates the risk to civilians, then those who refuse to do otherwise will be morally accountable for the resulting harm. References to AI inevitability need to be counterbalanced by a commitment to abstinence where needed. There are just obviously some aspects of warfare that should never be ceded to AI, and in such circumstances, the responsibility is to maintain a stark delineation between humans and machines. And this remains true no matter how toxic our relations get with other states. So that's it. That's my little rapid rant.
Okay, sure. I think to pick up on the points you raised, Neil, and throw my pen lid on the floor, I think that this is something that has been jarring from a legal perspective, an ethical perspective, since the I don't know, especially this framing of the responsible use of AI in the military domain. And I'm part and parcel of this conversation as an expert on this global commission of re-aim, sort of buying into this narrative that there is some particular standard of responsible use, and we're in the process of trying to figure out what that means and how to put guardrails up. There are many interested in guardrails, but what has been so jarring is indeed this inevitability discourse or understanding, and it's been sort of a joke within our small research group about how many times certainly military actors have said, the train has left the station. Right, that this is, you're either on board or you're not. And if we just take a second to think about how trains operate, if you're on a train that's not going to, if it's speeding at full steam ahead, that's not really a train you want to be on. Otherwise, the train ought to stop at the next station and we can get off, have a cup of coffee, take a walk around. And this translates, and this is not just to be cheeky about it, but I think it's also related in the military context to the understanding that there are other options. The agency is so important to underscore, to understand that it's not about a human in the loop, but rather it's about placing, where necessary, algorithms in the human loop. How can it help us make decisions better so that we're still in the driver's seat? And this is translated in military speak to something called tactical patience. We can slow down, and that's not just to slow down for slowing down's sake, but you also are able to understand and have better situational awareness in a military context if you're not operating at full steam ahead, right? You're understanding, you're gathering more data from not only algorithmically enhanced sources, but also human intelligence, understanding the scenario on the ground better so that you can operate better to fulfill your legal obligations. And I will say, for all of that's a very terrifying statement that you mentioned, Neil, that these legal and ethical concerns are secondary, perhaps. But within the military context, in our engagement with military actors and personnel, they are also quite interested in not killing civilians. This is not their overarching goal. So understanding that there can be some common denominator of language, engaging with them about the legitimacy of their own operations requires slowing down and asking ourselves about this inevitability question. One other comment before I hand over to Lauren is that something that we haven't directly talked about, but I was inspired by the comments regarding journalists, the role of journalism, language matters. And all of this is true. I think what's been really inspiring is to see how certain organizations, Air Wars, for example, using open source investigation techniques to sort of cut through the noise of misinformation in these very contested informational spaces when you don't have journalists on the ground from outside sources. Yes, indeed, we have Palestinian sources. We're relying heavily on them, and we are thankful, and in many cases, they're putting their lives on the line, as Anthony highlighted. But what the open source investigation allows us to do very specifically in this context of the Israeli case, seeing at first what happened once the 972 reporting first came out at the end of last year, that was met with cries from Israeli Defense Forces or Israeli sources as that was fake news, that it was completely fake, falsified, sensationalized, etc. And then to push back on that, how do you push back on, this is fake news, we're not operating from the same set of facts, but what the open source investigation techniques that Air Wars has done an incredible job of is putting data and clear and transparent methodology out into the world so people can come and check it for themselves. And it's incontrovertible the way that we can align the data that Air Wars has collected through these open source investigative techniques to corroborate the reporting, to push back on the narrative that it was fake news, right? And it's unfortunate that we have to do this, but in this age of dis and misinformation, I think it's important to understand that there are tools and they're being used in a way that I think is sort of the positive side of the datification of warfare, understanding where we can start using data to cut through some of that noise and to bring clarity in this particular situation. Thanks.
I want to come back to a question that was posed in the first session about how do we team up, right, Nitin? And I think this panel in many ways shows how we can team up, right? The interdisciplinary group of scholars and journalists working together that highlight different aspects of the algorithmic kill chain that we're talking about today and bring really important information together. And from the role of media in reinforcing certain language that is used to legitimize this role of AI in warfare, to the models that are built and by whom and how we as citizens also contribute to those sources of information, right down to the politics. And I think and of course Jessica bringing in the legal dimension is very important. But I think for me, as a conflict and war studies scholar, I think the politics is really important, right? What problems are we trying to solve with the rise and use of these technologies? These are deeply political problems. War is politics, right? How people mobilize, what organizations claim to represent civilians in the context of wars are deeply political. And we are now transitioning towards a worldview where we think that certain technologies are going to resolve or counteract deeply political issues. We've gone to this, okay, if we target militant leaders, then that will resolve deeply political issues. And I think this techno-solutionism, there is a lot of interest by very different actors to believe that this is the resolution to these problems. But I think we really have to think the short-term but also long-term political consequences of this way of war. We've, 20 years of interventionism in Afghanistan, like we were saying, these technologies and this way of war was tested there. And we saw that the mass killing of civilians through heavy reliance of airstrikes played right into the legitimacy and authority of Taliban coming in very easily, taking over, right? So we need to understand, what are these technologies believed to be a solution for? They think what Neil is talking about, they're a solution for that a lot of advanced militaries can't mobilize people any longer to fight. So this creates mass. They're a solution for keeping distance, right, from the battlefield. They're a solution for commercial enterprises who want to make money. So wars are not always about winning. They're a complex interest from many different actors involved. And I think once we start to unravel that, we'll understand why we see these particular technologies being embraced and enforced, but we'll also understand why they'll most likely lead to many more wars and not less.
Thank you, all of you, for opening this up. What I want to do, rather than ask you questions, is allow you space to ask each other some questions, because you've heard from each other very good interdisciplinary perspectives on this topic. So if you want, we can do a quick round of any questions you would like to pose to each other, and then I'll open it up to the audience to continue from there. So I'll give you a moment to think if there's something you want to ask each other. Since we've convened each other to do this teaming, and what do we want to ask our teammates about the challenges we are dealing with?
Can I kick off? Because I've got the microphone. So maybe for the data specialists amongst us, I was having a very interesting conversation with an engineer within the UK military who worked with Palantir Gotham. I saw it in your slide as one of the systems in the early, 2010-11 in Afghanistan. And what was interesting, he was telling us that actually there was a more advanced system. So in this point of time, it was mostly about bringing all these different sources of data together, and then intelligent operators sifting through this data. But what was happening is that complexity of data was not workable for a lot of the actual operators on the ground, so they'd preferred a simplified version of the world. So let's leave out, understanding the Afghan culture or understanding the relationship between the Taliban and the local population, and let's just, narrow our understanding of the battlefield to very easily, datafied and codified relations. So can you maybe reflect on that process? So what are these technologies? What is included in our knowledge of the battlefield, and what is, more importantly, excluded for them to be workable in these military contexts?
My knowledge is limited. I mean, we're also constrained by what information we're given about these systems. Everything that I've sourced is from public information and OSINT. But I think this also connects to what you mentioned this morning about how Lavender works and how the training data sets are constructed, right? So I think that this is one of the shortcomings about all AI systems, is that to understand that fundamentally they are built with a perspective in mind, because and I think also Mike studying data sets can tell us more about this as well, that for example, something like Lavender is going to be trained on an understanding of what a target is from its data set, but that understanding is based on what its designers understand a militant to be. So in that case, it's based on previous targets, and that might mean, to us, that might mean something very narrow, but to its designers, that might mean something much broader. So it might mean anyone who has worked in the civil service in Gaza, including rescue workers, including government officials, as you said, anyone between 18 and 40 or 18 and 50 who is male. So it's all constructed by the designers, and that goes all the way back to the beginning of those data sets. And as you said, the simpler, the better. So these systems are able to work with a number of different, we would call them features, but different types of information and decide what's most important. But that is all being built from what someone is inputting first to say, this is the data we'll choose to include. And not only that, but these are the questions we've decided to ask. And that's all coming from whoever is building it and what their viewpoint on the world is.
Can I ask a question? Do you want to say? Okay, I'll ask a question. Maybe channeling a very frustrated attendee I briefly spoke to during the coffee break. So far we've exclusively, I think, talked about the Israel-Palestine case, which I think is understandable, given what's happened there. But there are other cases right now where military AI and autonomous weapons are either being used or developed, including the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, where I think if you look at it from the perspective of Ukraine, we have a much more sympathetic actor there. For me, at least, I think what the use of military AI in the context of Israel's Lavender program is just manifestly egregious. But what Ukraine will say is that we're fighting an existential struggle right now against an adversary that's engaged in an imperial war, that's talked explicitly about extirpating Ukrainian identity and culture and stuff. And in these situations, we need to have every tool at our disposal in order to sort of fight a defensive war. And Ukraine has been very open about its development of AI. They have the Saka Scout and other things where I think if we're not fully in the area of an autonomous weapon, we're on the precipice of it. And their argument is that, you know, there are military exigencies here that we need to do. So my question to you, or to everyone, is, do you think there's something inherently wrong about the integration of artificial intelligence in the kill chain for targeting other human beings, in which case we should have a blanket prohibition against this? Or do you think it's more complex and it's a depends answer? Do you think it depends on the particular military conditions under discussion or even on the particular actors under discussion? So what kind of challenge are we dealing with, gang?
I'll jump into that one. What I think is really interesting, you're absolutely right. This is happening in different contexts, in different ways, and each one of them deserves different kind of analysis. So it's really difficult to say, oh, military AI is, and then put a value judgment on it. So in the Ukrainian context, like, there's an asymmetry that plays a role. Indeed, this is their existential conflict that they're fighting, and yeah, it's pretty, I suppose, quite easy as a lawyer to say, yeah, as long as you're following your legal obligations, I don't necessarily see any issue with the use of these particular technologies. On the other side of it, it's very difficult to understand how those are being interpreted, right? So I think there are particular initiatives ongoing right now at the UN in the context of the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems. They're trying to work out this idea of a two-tier system, that there's a certain class of weapon systems that is inherently incapable of complying with distinction, proportionality, etc. So those should be, and they are, there's argument that that's already forbidden under international humanitarian law, but we could exclude them. But that's at one end of the spectrum of autonomy, and the regulation of the rest is the problem, right? So we're understanding how is Ukraine using them in the conflict? Is that in compliance? Are they complying with their obligations to take all feasible precautions to make sure that they're only targeting legitimate military targets? And the same can be said for Russia. On the other side, Russia is also employing these kinds of things, and some horrific news has been in recent headlines about the use of quadcopter drones by Russia to hunt civilians. Human safari was the headline in the Telegraph recently. Understanding that these modalities are being used in these ways as well, and it makes it really complicated. So I think to walk back to the regulatory question, in every other context, we have like products liability law, and you have to prove that your product is fit for purpose before it comes to market. And we've done this completely the opposite way now. We're in an experimental phase where this is all happening on the battlefield testing experimentation without being able to show that this is in compliance. And I think I still struggle with that question because I don't understand how, the first thing we did when there were fatalities with self-driving cars was pull them from the market and regulate them to the teeth rate. That was the idea behind it. But here we have every single day in Russia, in Ukraine, in the context of Gaza, huge numbers of civilian casualties. Lives are on the line here, and we're not in the same kind of hurry. So I don't know the right answer for it, but I think that there are robust frameworks. We just have to look at them and push for those lenses to be used.
I think this beautifully, so I hope with our presentation that we kind of illustrated that these systems have been long in the making and they're being used in many different battlefields. And I think it's good to we just focused on Gaza to show, because we have this illustrative material to see how they change the human-machine, human interactions. I think Ukraine is a beautiful example of what we've just been talking about, the politics, right? So at the level of the often civilians that are mobilized into the Ukrainian army that have no military training, that they are sent to the front line, of course they're asymmetry, and the risk to their life is extremely high. So they, and research has shown this, they're really, willing to use any kind of new technology that might save their life. So their experimentation with these new technologies that are mostly provided by NATO countries, there's a high willingness to do so. But what we see in a lot of reporting is, in fact, what is needed is more boots on the ground, right? Russia is able to mobilize and send a lot of troops to the front line, and we see that is, in fact, where they're getting the overhand often. Again, this comes to the politics of using these technologies. NATO countries that are involved are willing to send weaponry, money, intelligence, their newest AI-driven systems, but not military boots to the ground. So we're seeing, from a conflict studies perspective, interesting combination of very old school warfare with front lines and trenches, combined with the sending and willing to experiment with all these different technologies, but also because of that, this is leading to a huge amount of destruction and civilian harm and civilian infrastructure being destroyed. But very little willingness to think through, maybe this war can't be won on the battlefield. Maybe we need to think about other solutions to this deeply political problem. So I think actually Ukraine is a very illustrative example when we feel that all these technologies are the way to win wars. It just escalates wars, entrenches them. And we have to think through what happens when enemy others are willing to both perceived enemy others, send boots to the ground as well as use these technologies. Where does that leave us, right, in the future of warfare? And I think that's what worries me mostly.
Let's have Mike ask the next question.
Thank you. I'll take this opportunity to ask a question really, quite selfishly as somebody who's a journalism studies person but not a conflict studies person. So the brief background I'll give is, especially in the United States, local journalism is being decimated, journalists are being laid off, the amount of time and expertise that is able to be dedicated to thoughtful reporting on events not only in local areas but global issues as well, it's not there. We're just seeing in the US just the degradation of news as an industry, and not necessarily journalism as a practice, but news as an industry. So I'm seeing a lot of news organizations just hungrily using generative AI as a way to save costs and create more content faster and be able to sell ads against that, and there's sort of an efficiency, quote-unquote efficiency of it. So I come at this problem of sort of watching this efficiency logic that's happening at the same time recognizing the need for careful, effective, humane, and sort of deeply nuanced and sensitive reporting on conflicts happening around the world. And so I then, my mind goes to what kinds of interventions can practically be made to help, especially in the US context, audiences understand conflicts that they just often don't understand. And there's sort of a rare set of people who's paying attention well enough and deeply enough to these. So with that background, I guess my pointed question is there's a lot of style guides are often sort of the lingua franca of news organizations, right? You have the AP style guide, and there's some style guides like the DART Institute has created a style guide for trauma-informed journalism. There's the Thompson Foundation has a style guide for conflict reporting. If you could sort of, thinking about your expertise in conflict reporting, almost like wave a magic wand and be sitting beside a beleaguered journalist who has to churn out 6 to 8 stories in a small town news organization and doesn't have the time to do it, what would you want that journalist to know or be sensitive about or take into account when they're creating news for audiences that are not paying attention but should be? How can we help news get better at the kind of nuance? Like Air Wars is fantastic, forensic architecture is fantastic, but in a way, I think those are sort of niche and specialty news organizations. So I'm wondering, what would you do if you were sitting beside those journalists?
I can give another microphone to whoever wants it.
Okay, this will be a sort of unsatisfying answer, but maybe inevitably. 2 things spring to mind that won't solve anything, but are just things that really annoy me. One, I think just don't accept Silicon Valley claims at face value. Pop the hood. I don't think it takes much time to just work out exactly what 97.2% means. Like, these people just get to say stuff. They get to say, we've developed this weapon system that's able to identify whether a human is armed with a 97.2% success rate. And then you click the link, and it was used in a shopping mall in Texas when everyone was standing in a line coming through a metal detector. Like, just an utterly alien context to war, which is riven by uncertainties, and the fact that someone even has a gun is insufficient evidence that they're targetable. So I think just a bit more of a firewall on sort of techno-optimistic bullshit peddling, I'd like. And also just as a general thing, just whenever there's a temptation to use a euphemism, actually say what the euphemism is. Like we talk endlessly about the kill chain and collateral damage and pacification, and it injects this bloodlessness into warfare. I think, and it frustrates me whenever anyone is doing it. Like when we had that big, should we impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine debate a while back, I just would appreciate people just saying what they mean, which is, should NATO go to war against Russia over Ukraine? And then, let's have an argument about that, the pros and cons of that outcome. It's the same in Israel and Palestine. It's the same when you're talking about these technologies. There's such a temptation because they're shiny and chromatic to just think we've managed to cut the Gordian knot. We've managed to get it all. We've got maximum military effectiveness and no one's dying, and we can kind of weave in between civilians in a marketplace and just take out who we want to take out. And I don't think the answer to this leads you to kind of a pacifistic outcome. I do think there's value and utility to violence on occasion. But just let's at least be clear with what we're talking about. What's it worth to you? What are we willing to pay for the violence we're imposing? And just anything that can get us as far away as possible from this sort of bloodless, sterile rhetoric, I would appreciate.
Let's pass. Yes. Who wants to go next?
Can I, just a few things. I also, full disclosure, I'm married to a journalist. I also am in the executive board of Air Wars, so these are close to my heart in a lot of ways. But I think, I also supervise a lab that teaches students open source investigation techniques. We work with Bellingcat to train students in these skills. I think media literacy needs to be part of the conversation. Like, and I'm talking about small children need to learn how to distinguish fake news, etc. This needs to be part of an educational curriculum across the board. We need to pay for journalism. We need to pay for quality journalism. So that is an individual choice we can all make. We can all embrace that, because that is probably, I'm not trying to journalism-splain to the expert on the stage, but this is why that we've seen this erosion. I'm also from the US originally. We've seen the erosion of these newsrooms, and then the increased pressure. I get why people, AI is the accelerant, speed and scale. It's across the board in every sector, the same thing. But if we pay for journalism and require the quality to be higher, then that's maybe something that could help. I think back to your question about what to say to the journalists who are struggling with this stuff, is to also push back harder on governmental-led statistics militaries who also try to undercut organizations like forensic architecture or civil society, questioning methodology when those are the organizations who are very clear about their methodologies. So these are also really easy, perhaps akin to Neil's intervention there, about kind of easy work to do to push back on narrative formation from the interests behind the military operations. Do you have thoughts?
I just want to comment that I think there may be a new kind of journalism that's emerging now, because you mentioned Air Wars, Bellingcat, open source investigations, the role of data visualization, the role of creating new kinds of journalistic formats that help us understand these complex things in a different way. That requires we train journalists on data, on working with complex forms like this. And journalism might move to more interactive forms of engaging with stories that use data all the time. So I find that really exciting for us to be thinking about. How do we change journalism inside out as a form that's much more intriguing? Let's go to Ingmar.
Yeah, maybe just following up on this, I'm curious to see do you have any optimism concerning something? For example, as I see it, more and more data is actually becoming accessible, right? Like, for example, on satellite imagery side, right, there are more and more satellites going up all the time, price point is coming down, right? Like, even as a sort of like outsider, right, you no longer need to be like a nation state to actually access satellite imagery. Is that a good thing, sort of, or so? If it sort of reduces information inequality, or is that a bad thing because it, I don't know, it proliferates sort of other things? Just curious, like how you see these things.
Yeah, I think it's. I think we have to be careful not to kind of mimic the militaries that we're investigating and their operations, in that I think open source investigation and using satellite imagery and social media tracking is a really good starting point to tell the story about the impact of war. But I also, the value of actually doing on-the-ground investigation as journalists, as researchers, to actually go witness, see, smell, experience what people have lived through and tell that story, their lived experience, is, I think, incredibly important to supplement those two things. And I think that is still possible. We live in a world in which everybody is being securitized. The military is being securitized, journalists are being securitized, academics. It's nearly impossible for me to go to a conflict or war zone because my institution won't allow me to do it. I'm a war studies scholar. Why do we have a field of war and conflict studies if you're not going to actually allow people to investigate the impact of wars that are waged in our name? So I think we need to definitely utilize these different technologies, but also, not forget that the on-the-ground investigations are incredibly important to supplement our knowledge of what's happening.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I also wonder, how can we make it personal for all of us? And how can we keep it historically situated? So how can we bring in the political histories that lead to this, as someone brought up in the question earlier, keeping it, looking at it through these colonial lenses, and also the technical histories, that this is part of a continuum of how technologies have worked, that this is, as you said, not a revolution, but an evolution of these systems that, not to quote the IDF, very often, but that they are working with information processing and databases, that these AI systems are not something, like, we're not really thinking about autonomous systems, we're thinking about these very tangible databases, data centers, and these things that we actually have media studies and journalism studies and conflict studies, histories of techniques, methodologies for analyzing this. But also, how do we connect it with ourselves here if we're not necessarily in a war zone at the moment? How do we make it personal to us? And I think it's by remembering again that, like, this may be tested in colony spaces, but that's always brought back to the places, you know, we have Césaire's imperial boomerang. This is very much connected to us and our bodies, even if we're not there.
I want to give a last comment to Christian, and then I want to open up to the audience. We'll have plenty, I hope we'll have time for your questions. So Christian, do you want to share anything I think you wanted to add?
Yeah, I want to say thank you, and I want to keep that track with this multi-perspective, what we need. And what I recognized in the last 10 years, I would say, in my peace work, but also in my work in in informatics, that is the most hard thing is to finding a language that people understand, and that's I don't know. I'm dealing with that problem since 10 years, trying to find methods how to extract that inner things, what we all see and what we all know since 20 years. We know since 20 years the systems are not able to separate civilians from competence. Since more than 20 years, we know that. And still, from the civil society, from the power from civil society, we have a lot of problems to talk about that. And this is the base, I mean, the base for law, for implementing laws that we are on the ground. Talk about that.
Thank you. I want to open up the floor to your questions. So I'll run around with the mic, and I think I saw Miriam start, and then I'll come back to the others. So,
Nitin, I wanted to pour a little bit of cold water on your optimism about the future of journalism, I'm afraid. A couple of things. We know that there are highly influential media that are not run for profit, okay? So when I'm looking at the UK media scene, GB News is taken over as one of the kind of daytime news channels. It's not run for profit. No one's making money off GB News. It's run at a loss, and it's run at a loss because there's an understanding of the power of communicating to housewives like my mum day to day as they're doing the dishes. And that's a reality. We also have to acknowledge that the sources of journalism that we've long relied on, places like The Guardian, are essentially requiring, and I'm sorry to put it in these terms, people to be kind enough to donate. We cannot rely on people donating to be able to fund the type of journalism that we're talking about here. This is a genuine crisis in our industry. I don't know if you followed what's just happened with the Daily Telegraph in the UK. The Daily Telegraph, which is a national newspaper in the UK, has just been bought out by an American gentleman. He was, after Qatar was blocked from purchasing it, the gentleman in question is David Efune, proprietor of the New York Sun, who is a rabid Zionist. These papers don't make money. So let's just be honest about the function of these outlets today. They operate as a propaganda arm of private individuals and private interests. That's what a lot of journalism has been reduced to. And so unless we're in the game of competing, I heard what you said about not imitating the militaries. We can either imitate the model of counter-influence, or we have to find an alternative. But at the moment, we are relying on, let's just be kind and donate to the good people doing journalism from, their cupboards, in their back rooms, and giving up their time. We cannot keep going like this. There is a real problem that has to be resolved around the way that we report, and I would love some reflections on how we get around that, because the real war we're losing is a narrative war.
Thank you, Miriam, for grounding us on the role of traditional journalism that we have to keep supporting. I want to do this. I'm going to take a couple of questions and we'll give a chance for you guys to answer them together. So let's try this.
So I actually just want to follow up on what you were saying. So as a person who comes from the Middle East, to me, Western journalism has failed us and has failed me. And I'm not even sure that it should continue. Like, I do not pay money and I will not pay money to Western journalism. I get my news from social media, and that's like the most reliable thing. So how do we get past this? How do we have reliable, unbiased sources of information that delivers what it actually is, instead of using bloodless euphemisms like you mentioned? Yeah, that's all.
Right, and how do we support more Global South journalists to be part of the mainstream? Maybe is another question. Let me continue back here with more questions.
Thank you.
And introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Vesna. I'm a student at the Hertie School in Berlin. And I'm wondering, like, we know that these systems rely on the same methods that a lot of consumer systems are using. We also know that so much data is being stored in other countries. It's being stored by private corporations. Like, all of this we know, but are countries actually preparing for the possibility of these systems being used against them, or is it just, like, are they just creating the systems, or are they also preparing the countermeasures to be able to protect their own citizens? Because, you know, if the system is out there, it can be used against you. So yeah, does this go hand in hand with better cybersecurity, or is that part just completely ignored for now?
I want to give a few more people a chance to ask, and then we will begin to close the conversation for lunch, but let me see if anybody else has a hand up, and I'll walk towards you.
Thank you for everything today. My name's Essie Lindstedt, and I wanted to follow up particularly with Lauren and Ingmar to hear a bit more about the discussion you were having about the sort of using the tech for good and not just evil, and the value of lived experience. And what came into my mind was when I was in Afghanistan in 2012, and we were looking at girls' education and seeing communities who were engaging in Taliban-controlled areas to push out the envelope and secure more space for girls' education to happen. And now you look at 2024, and one thought that stays in my head is what would have empowered those communities more to secure better benefits for themselves and their girls and women in Afghanistan? Is there anything out of all of this that gives us hope that citizens can use some of this technology?
Thank you. Are there any other questions? And I'm willing to run to other sides. Let me try and get to you, but here's, you can help me, Ville.
Hi, I'm Sadir. I'm a writer and activist. Thank you for bringing Ukraine into the conversation. I want to also offer, because there was a discussion of NATO and Ukraine and boots on the ground, I want to offer for consideration the idea that Ukraine is used as a weapons laboratory by NATO in the same way that Palestine is being used as a weapons laboratory by Israel. But my question is, now that we've brought Ukraine in, we talked about Ukrainian resistance, Russian aggression, Israeli aggression. We haven't mentioned resistance in Palestine. And so I'd be curious, obviously the Palestinian resistance doesn't have access to these kinds of technologies, but to the extent that they could or do or might, I would be curious to hear your positions on that, given that there seems to be an approval of Ukrainian use of these systems. And I would extend that to Lebanese resistance, which does seem to use them, and has in fact scrupulously complied with international law, striking only military targets. And in their recent, whether it was an assassination attempt or not, they hit specifically the Prime Minister's bedroom with a single drone, rather than 85 tons of bombs on a civilian neighborhood. So, yeah.
I'll take one more from Megan in front, and then we will see if there's no more. We can just kind of try and wrap up. So I'm trying to run around like this. It's really fun.
Thank you very much for that effort, floating around. I'm Megan from Air Wars, and I guess first of all, thank you so much for referring to our work so much. It's great to kind of see it presented in this way. I'm curious to hear more about some of the norm setting kind of approach that you're taking and the stuff that we're working in terms of norm setting. And thinking in particular about this dual process to ban certain weapons and regulate others, but also looking at Ukraine, as people are talking about, and if we... Okay. looking very much at Ukraine and like you're looking at this, if we give the good guys the ability to kind of practice the use of these weapons, the bad guys will use them too. It's like looking at how can we kind of build this norm. I'm keen to hear a bit more about whether you think there's space for that norm setting with states and whether there's any optimism at all or if it's just a very kind of scary space to be in.
Okay, we have a lot of questions on the table, but oh my God, I'm going to have to give a chance to somebody right in the back, and then we'll try to wrap up. So how fast can I get up here? Here we go.
Hi, Karim Amdi. I've been working in AI for 5 years, and let's say I'm a lot left-leaning. And when I think about all those questions we pose with AI in warfare, journalism, and so on and so forth, and the decline of journalism, it seems that we're always fighting against entrenched money interests, and that if you just think on this technology level, on the surface level, you're kind of turning around and never finding a solution. So the only thing I seem to see is like, do we have to think about the system in general, like go dig deep and try to change the whole system? Because me personally, I can't seem to find a way out just looking at the single issues. Maybe the question is too big, so feel free to skip it if it's...
Okay, wonderful questions, thank you. Let's get the panelists to try and respond to them collectively.
Maybe short to how to find a way out and about this imitating military language. I think we are not imitating, but we are just a part of it because the military complex during the last 20 years occupied civil spaces completely, the security policies, but also our open spaces at all. When you remember the new concept from the NATO is called multi-domain operations. We are talking about hyperwar, about battlefields which goes in all civil spheres which are defined as battlefields. Our spaces here, civilian people. And sometimes I'm wishing to have something on the hand to get out of that which we are actually a part of it. Also that we are using, for example, the same ChatGPT-like systems for this NLP tools. Then the soldiers using it very experimentally also. We have to say Palantir is an example which is very deep in that, but we know also that they use ChatGPT just like we do with the same interface. And yeah, and sometimes I'm wishing so. We had in Germany, we had Bertolt Brecht, and he used the alienation effect in his theater to have a step out from this piece. And of course, we need much more methods to have a step out from this technological daily life to find ways, to talk about.
I'll just jump in really briefly to say, on the journalism funding point, totally agree, echo. It gets even a little bit worse in the sense that there's recent initiatives in the United States where tech companies are beginning to fund news organizations, but in doing so, they're putting constraints or requirements to use generative AI tools that the tech companies themselves are developing within the newsrooms in order to get the funding. So it gets even worse. So when I think about all these things, I would be a little cautious about only getting news from social media, just because you're also susceptible to the algorithmic logics of the social media platforms and how they're doing it. I've done some work recently with the so I'm Canadian, put that on the table, with the Canadian Ministry of Heritage. And here, this might be a controversial thing to say, but especially in sort of an American and Canadian context, I truly think one of the things that's not been tried nearly enough is independently administered state funding for journalism. And the reason I say that is because when the marketplace or the technology companies or the feeling of wanting to contribute to something in a voluntary way, all of those things are put on the table as the primary mechanisms to fund journalism, I think you have a lot of the problems. But if you can at least put a large part of funding within a democratically accountable system with all of the caveats and problems with that, absolutely for sure, what I hear from journalists most often is to say, please get out of my way. Stop making me be susceptible to tech companies, to marketplace, to emotional signals of platform companies. There's a whole bunch of pressures that journalists absolutely have often when they're trying to create news. I think we need to do as much as possible to try to let journalists do their work. And I do think state funding, if it can be administered, and there's good evidence of that being able to happen, I think in Western context, we haven't necessarily given state funding the kind of due that it deserves. So I'll stop there. Yeah, CBC as well. I've been an advisor for CBC as well in Canada.
Sure, yeah, thanks. I want to reply to the question or the comment related to sort of using some of these methods sort of for good. I mean, it's tricky. For example, I mean, in the migration context, okay, so, there's a lot of interest in predicting migration, right, like sort of, and, the people I work with, right, they have the best intentions, right, oh yeah, we want to, sort of know when the refugees come so we can support them, right, but, realistically, I don't know if this is how technology would be used, right, like sort of, so if the model predicting, oh, there are like, I don't know, 500,000 Syrians coming to Germany in 2 months, right, I mean, would we ready the welcome center, or would we sort of try to, sort of keep them at a distance, right, so in that domain, it's really sort of, it is tricky. I mean, we're trying to navigate this space. In other domains, it's a bit easier, right? We're also doing work on like sort of gender gaps and digital gender gaps and sort of mapping like where in the world sort of women are at a disadvantage when it comes to internet access or sort of so. There, the risk for abuse is less. I mean, I don't see any obvious use how this could be misused. Sort of, so maybe there might be sort of a right, but it's actually still of operational use for different organizations, such as, for example, also the Gates Foundation is interested in this sort of operational planning, sort of, right, if they want to have an intervention of providing sort of internet access. In Afghanistan, in particular, actually, we have a project trying to provide programming education, also using these chatbots or sort of so to Afghani women, both in Afghanistan but also abroad, sort of so. So that's something that we are sort of doing, but it's less on the data side, but more on the sort of the Gen AI side. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it at this for now.
Okay, a quick point on the question regarding norm setting. And I do think this is critically important, and I do think even with conflicts where we sympathize with the actors, like Ukraine, you are setting down normative and legal templates that other people pick up. We saw this with R2P, we've seen this with a bunch of things. You leaving stuff on the ground that others will either misuse or use correctly in ways that you don't appreciate. So I think we absolutely have to think about this in the context of AI, and I don't think we've done it enough. And I actually think this entire debate, which you mentioned earlier at the United Nations and elsewhere, where we talk about responsible AI, this whole thing is through the lens of the user. We imagine ourselves as creators and users of this technology, and there's virtually no discussion on the idea of these technologies being used against us, and it completely marginalizes all the people impacted by this stuff. And if you think of it broader, not just the user, but the used against, you expand beyond responsibility and talk about rights, and maybe you've got a narrower ambit of what you're allowed to do. I think the responsibility discourse sometimes is this very kind of rubber stamp action where we put this imprimatur on what we're doing, and it ends up with the kind of maximalist permissiveness. And I think even instrumentally, you do have an obligation to think about, okay, eventually other people will be able to use this, so down the road, what kind of, things would we not like to see for our own benefit? And I think this is true across so much. The entire US drone program was conceptualized with this assumption that this will never be done to us to a degree, and I think that naturally lends itself to this highly permissive approach to targeting. But at the same time, your point on the imperial boomerang, I think is absolutely true, but we also have to remind ourselves that even if it wasn't true, there's reason enough to care about the poor Palestinians and everyone else getting bombed to rubble. We also need this kind of expansion of our zone of application, that even if ultimately nothing gets revisited upon us, there is just sort of basic moral obligations, and first principles mean that innocent people shouldn't get murdered regardless of the context. Yeah.
We're going to try and wrap up in the next 3 minutes. We can try and find a way to lunch waiting for us. So let's
I have a very long list. I completely agree with you. I think, we all need to care about these things on first principles, and I think that in order to make caring about these things actionable, it's just how do we make it connected to us. In answer to the question about countermeasures for these issues. I have not seen any evidence of governments dealing with this. More, quite the opposite. Like spyware, governments are using this against other countries' citizens. I don't think it's in their interest to mitigate this. It's more of the train has left the station kind of arguments. More so, I think we can look to radical examples of obfuscation and tactics from outside the kind of mainstream for this. And I think that also circles back to the question about resistance, both in Palestine and Lebanon. And I think the Lebanon example is perfect because it does show that these systems can be used with precision, but we're simply choosing not to use them that way. But yet again, I think all of us have the capacity to undertake a kind of computational or technical literacy to not be overwhelmed by these systems, to try to understand them and know that it isn't mystical. It is possible to know what's happening with them and not to get overwhelmed. It is not a purely a domain outside of our understanding, and that I think that's part of our responsibility because they will impact us.
30-second responses from the rest of you. Let's try. Christian, and then the rest, if anyone wants to.
Okay, to your point about a one-way traffic, basically, like we just design these systems from a user's perspective. It's our job, I think, as critical voices to hold the mirror up and push that question back to them. It's been very eerie to me just yesterday in London at a meeting, a very high-level meeting about, oh, well, what happens when the non-state actors, the terrorist groups get this kind of technology? They're going to use it in these scary ways. That's the way that you've been using it too. That's not a popular message, but it was the message that I felt that I needed to bring, and to hold that mirror up and to understand that you can't have it both ways. If you're using it this way, you're permissively showing these interpretations of law are accessible across the board. Unacceptable for them, then it means it's unacceptable for you. It's a hard truth, but it's the truth, and we need to keep pushing that and being very critical and pushing back about how states are using these systems, because the chickens will come home to roost, and they need to be prepared for that.
Your last statement. Let's go.
Last statement. Ooh, pressure on. I think the idea of a war is a laboratory. All wars are a laboratory, and I think we have to really get to grips with that. And that's kind of understanding wars not always about winning, but there's complex psychological, economical, political interests being served. About how these technologies are used against civilians in Western democracies. There is no doubt that they're being used in policing that, and that's what I talked about in the first panel. Same actors, same technologies to track and trace and target, in this case often arrest and not killing, of civilians in Western democracies. And I think that pivots us back to we have to have a broader understanding of harm and the political consequences. So if we just look at the amount of people arrests, we don't understand that when somebody's wrongly arrested in a community, then their community starts asking questions about them. Are they a criminal? Why are the policing moving into their home and arresting them? They start being excluded by their community. This leads them to, compounding forms of harm. It's harder to access a job market, etc. That might, in the end, lead them to becoming the criminals that they were targeted for in the first place. Same when it goes to harm. When we investigate harm, let's not just look at civilian casualties, look at the reverberating effects, but also how people give meaning to harm. When they are being killed, or their family members, by bombardments, and they have no face to who is carrying out, or technologies are carrying, they give meaning to this sort of harm. This creates grievances that lead to the mobilization of new generations of radicalized and militant people, because they have no other option, right? Or there are very few other options. So these are the long-term political consequences that we have to think about when we're studying, I think, the impact of these forms of technology.
Thank you, Lauren. Let's thank all our panelists. So we are running a little behind, but we are going to catch up. Lunch is served right here. It's going to be nice Moroccan tagine and vegetarian food, so please join us for lunch. And then we will come back here in half an hour for a short keynote. This is a rapid fire day, but please enjoy the break time with all of your colleagues.